They go have dinner, they go have a drink, they come back to the factory the next day, it's all gone. And they have no idea how it's been done. That was China's speed. The Chinese were just awing Apple all the time.
At the start of 2026, supply chains are no longer just about cost and efficiency, but it's also about power, dependency, and strategic choices. Right now, we can see much of the global conversations and much of this show focused on TSMC in Taiwan. Apple has been navigating the space over 3 decades, quietly but at a massive scale. From exiting from South Korea to depending its tie with Taiwan and also betting heavily on China. As we all know, Apple doesn't just build products, it builds a whole ecosystem, same to manufacturing design. As of today, we can see the US is pushing for decoupling and reshoring, and also China is accelerating its self-reliance in tech space. I guess the real question today is not whether Apple succeeded, but does that success have a cost? Perhaps more importantly, what does that cost mean for Taiwan? Joining me is Patrick McGee, the former Financial Times Apple correspondent and also the author of Apple in China. Welcome to my show.
Thank you, Catherine.
It's so nice to have you here. I guess my very first general question is, what is it like to be on Jon Stewart's?
Oh, it was like the career highlight, if not life highlight. It was amazing. I mean, I've been watching Jon Stewart since I was in college, so I didn't tell anybody that I was going to be on the show, even though I knew for 3 months, because I was certain it was going to be canceled.
Why is that? Why do you feel this way?
Well, I was just nervous. I just thought if I told anybody, then what if it didn't happen? I'd have to let them know. Yeah.
For me, it's not a typical book interview. What do you think?
I mean, he joked about us being best friends.
Yes.
I mean, I wasn't...
Almost.
Yeah.
Because you two had a different...
Yeah. No, I mean, it went better than I could have expected. I didn't do any prep work. I didn't have anyone play the role of Jon Stewart because I wasn't sure how it was all going to go, and I just winged it, and I think it went really well. It's really funny. I'm not funny, but he's really funny.
So in your book, you describe that Apple basically outsourcing its political agenda or its government relationship to Foxconn, and the arrangement works for years. And Foxconn basically leveraged all the policy incentive offered by Beijing until 2013.
Yeah.
CCTV aired a report just after 36 hours that Xi Jinping took office. I think that's a quite dramatic chapter in this book. Do you think that is the first moment that Apple realized, I have no grasp whatsoever to the political dynamic?
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. I mean, I didn't know that, but that's what Apple executives told me. And if you talk to Apple executives who joined Apple and moved to China in 2013, 2014, they thought they were joining an organization that had cracked China, that understood the politics, that knew how to do all these initiatives. And they were stunned at how little Apple executives in Cupertino actually knew about the country at all. They didn't know the first damn thing in a way. And it's because, and this was a great revelation to me, and so hopefully it's a revelation to the readers, that among the reasons is that Foxconn had just taken care of all that for them. So Foxconn sort of had this business model where they were really vertically integrating and having clients grow dependent on them. And by doing more than just the assembly, by sort of going backwards throughout the product to understand each component so that they could sort of take control of the supply chain, they needed lots of real estate and they needed lots of workers, and then they built dormitories for those workers and so forth. And that began in the late 1980s in China, right, in Shenzhen. And so the result of that was that Terry Guo had facilitated all these discussions, all these incentive packages with the local cadres. He'd really learned to work the political system. And so Apple was a star client, but Apple sort of wasn't aware of all the things that Terry Guo was doing to get everything done. So Apple has this moment in 2013 where they begin to worry that our products might be blacklisted in China.
Yes.
At a time when Google had been blacklisted, Facebook had been blacklisted, and they're realizing we don't actually have anybody senior living in the country, and we never have, and we need to take control of this relationship.
How do they manage this crisis? What's the solution to that?
So for the first time, they hire or they transfer over to China, people that are experts in operations and people that are experts in China to oversee everything. Operations, Apple University, procurement, retail, commercial advertising, I mean, anything you can think of. So they can really begin working with government officials themselves and take ownership. So the big worry is that China sees Apple as an exploitative force. And Apple has to sort of come up with their own strategy of like, how do we convince local officials that like we're actually doing a lot for your country?
Yes, that's a narrative they put together.
Yeah, because Apple, as anyone knows, especially journalists, is a very secretive company. And what I didn't know is that they are so secretive that Beijing had no idea what Apple was doing. So they could see them making a lot of money, and they could see them making a lot of products and a lot of money. But it wasn't clear that the companies Apple was relying on were also getting a lot of money. And so if you were to look at, like, say, Foxconn margins and Apple margins, in the early 2000s, Apple was actually the smaller of the two companies. So Foxconn was making more money and higher margins than Apple when they first sort of joined hands in 2000. By 2013, Apple is making 26% margins, up from 1%, and Foxconn's have gone from 10% to about 3%. So it really looks like Apple is squeezing Foxconn, and you could see why a lawyer for Xi Jinping would say, this is a really exploitative Western company. And so Apple's response, this takes some time, and this is like sort of 4 chapters in the book, right? Is to convince Beijing it's true that lots of companies working for us are not making a lot of money, but it's because we're effectively giving them tuition. We're effectively giving them training at a world-class level. Our best engineers are sleeping on the factory floor and really driving an indigenous innovation ecosystem within China. And this was music to the ears of Beijing.
Yeah, Beijing bought the story.
Well, it's a true story. Yeah, I mean, they bought it, but they rightfully bought it. Apple, I think, has done tremendous things for the country.
I see. Because it's very interesting. For a decade, there's a belief that once the United States is doing trade with China, naturally it's going to nurture the democracy in China. Till it's proven wrong.
Yeah, I mean, so I try not to hold like scorn for anyone who had that belief in the 90s and the 2000s, because this was like a bipartisan view in America. I think you could even call this part of the American mindset, that after 1945, when America is the victor in World War II, they have something like 50% global capacity of manufacturing. But they realize that if they have all that capacity, who are they going to export to? If the rest of the world is sort of in ruins, as Europe is after World War II, there's nobody that they can sell things to. So they developed this system of interdependence, right? This is Pax Americana. It basically lasts until the Trump administration, and it's wildly successful in certain ways. And Taiwan is, of course, a star in this whole regime, as is Japan, as is Korea, as is West Germany. I mean, these are countries that go from authoritarian regimes, right? I mean, Taiwan's under martial law until the 1990s, into thriving middle-class democracies. And America tried to do the same thing with China, and that was a strategic mistake, and it looks naive in retrospect. I do hold out some sort of thinking that it could have happened, but China's a 5,000-year, ancient civilization, really proud, 4 times the population of America.
Yes.
And it's, in retrospect, it looks clearer that they were never going to fit inside a system designed by somebody else.
So do you think it's a confidence or it's a blind spot? And whether this consensus actually sort of blind them?
So if you went back in time and then the history played out a few different ways, I think some of the times it's possible that maybe China actually sort of entered the system in the same way that Taiwan did. But September 11th meant that America was not so concerned about World Trade Organization and China adhering to the values that it was supposed to adhere to. It got really concerned by the Middle East. And then by the end of the decade, America was completely mired in the financial crisis. So they really took their eye off the ball for 2 decades. And during those 2 decades, China became an absolute manufacturing powerhouse. So without those different events, if we have a different version of history, maybe things would have gone a little bit different, and China would have fit more into the system, and maybe you wouldn't have got Xi Jinping. I don't know, but I don't think history is inevitable. I think it's really contingent, and so if it were so obvious that China was never going to be part of the system, then yeah, you probably should have scorn for the people that believed in something different in the 1990s. But I don't think it's fair to those people or to just the way we view history to use 2020 hindsight.
I see. But you also argue Apple didn't just help China manufacture smartphones. It also helped train the entire industrial system, that including when we see EV right now, electric vehicles, aerospace, even defense manufacturing today. As a Taiwanese, all Taiwanese, I guess, we are very concerned of this process.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of what goes into building 230 million iPhones per year, in addition to all the other Apple products, you're talking about logistics and infrastructure and trading from one factory to another, like these entire ecosystems, the fact that they're building iPhones is just like one facet of what's being trained up, right, around these whole industrial clusters. A drone is an iPhone with propellers. An EV is an iPhone on wheels.
Yeah.
Once you master those technologies, whether it's camera modules and lithium-ion batteries and just like the whole production setup with these conveyor belt systems and everything, you can kind of build anything.
Would you say it's sort of a case of strategic sleepwalking that Apple unintentionally accelerate capabilities now it fears?
Yeah, I mean, I like to say there's no villains in the narrative, right? When Tim Cook is introduced, for instance, I think it's a pretty fair portrayal of who he is. It's not a sort of biting 2020 hindsight look that sort of damns him out of greed or something like that and says that he did this. The one sort of biting thing I would say is that in Supply Chain 101, you would say you don't put all your eggs in one basket, right? And somehow the narrative of the book from the very get-go has been, how did the world's most sophisticated company make such a strategic amateur hour error?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, it's interesting that you brought up Tim Cook. I want to talk a little bit about Tim Cook because I noticed, from past interview, you once said that Tim Cook should not have become CEO in 2011. But to a lot of shareholders, he actually delivered extraordinary returns.
Yes.
So do you see the dilemma here?
So that's something I said. It's not in the book, but the reason I say it is because I don't think Tim Cook was ever going to leave Apple. To know anything about Tim Cook is to know that he absolutely loves Apple. In other words, if he did not become CEO, he still would have been the chief operating officer, and I still think he would have delivered all the things that he has delivered. Right? So I'm not discounting the value he has brought to the company. He, of course, has brought that value. My point is that even if someone else was CEO, he would have done all the things he's already famous for today, right? But because he's not a visionary, he's not a product designer, I think with a better CEO, they would have got all the operational prowess of Tim Cook, and then they also would have got maybe better products, right? A lead in AI strategy, and just more revolutionary fervor of the company.
Do you have a candidate in mind?
Well, no, but to some extent, that's also the problem of Tim Cook, because although he's very skilled, right, he's an operational genius and all sorts of things, he hasn't been great at hiring talent. If you look at Apple's top executives, most of them are from the Steve Jobs era, or they've been failures. So Isabel Mahi is the head of Greater China. She's a figurehead with no real power. The two successors to Johnny Ive in the last six years have both left the company in recent years, one of them just a month or two ago. Angela Ahrendts was a major hire for Tim Cook. She was the CEO of Burberry. She lasted 2 or 3 years before she either left or was fired. It's the people that Steve Jobs hired that are still sort of leading the company. The ones that Tim Cook has put in place have flopped on their face.
And also diversification didn't happen in 2011, right?
Yes. Well, so 2013 to me is the period where Apple realizes, oh shit, we've got a real problem in China.
Yeah.
That's also the time period in which Tim Cook did something Steve Jobs had never done, which is instituted a buyback program to use Apple's profits to reward shareholders.
Yeah.
I think if they had put those monies into took that money and put it into resiliency into the supply chain, in other words, if they were doing all the things they're pretending to do now, but actually doing them in 2013, Apple would be in a much, much safer position. And frankly, so would America.
I guess my question is, what does that lesson mean for Taiwan today, or in very general aspects, tech company in general?
So having spent this week in Taiwan, the most stunning statistic I've heard is that some years ago, let's say 2012, Taiwanese foreign direct investment, 90% of it was going into China.
Yes.
That's down to 5 to 10% today. So Taiwan is making major changes to diversifying its investments so that it's not just directed into a country that doesn't even view Taiwan as a country. So they're doing all the things that I want Apple to be doing. And Apple is a richer company than any of the Taiwanese companies who are very deliberately making those moves. So for instance, TSMC is investing $165 billion into Arizona alone to build 6 fabs. You cannot find me a single facility that Apple is funding anywhere on the planet outside of China that comes anywhere close to that sort of investment. But Apple has way higher profits and wherewithal to make those sort of investments. So Taiwan is really making all the strategic decisions that I think Apple should be making, and they're failing.
What do you think we can get away with this efficiency blindness dilemma, but Apple couldn't?
Well, so Tim Cook has been called Mr. Spreadsheet before. And, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But in a sense, part of the book is about if you are just staring at a spreadsheet and you're looking at margins and, the cost of capital and things like that, like in what column do you put geopolitical risk? It's not a quantifiable number. So if you talk to the sort of product managers back in the 2000s, each one of them is sort of independently choosing China because it just makes sense for their particular project. But it was up to Tim Cook or someone like Steve Jobs to recognize that even though each of those decisions was rational, in the aggregate, it was creating a real problem. It was creating a real dependence and therefore creating a real vulnerability. And they still haven't rectified that. And it's been 25 years, basically.
So if you were to give advice to Tim Cook right now, I know from the book you're saying it's too late now.
I was going to say all my advice is like, something that they could have done 10 years ago. But so just to explain to the listener why they can't really make the decisions now. Like, so the English title is that they're captured by China. And the reason I say that isn't to sell books. It's because I think that it's really the position that they're in, which is that the more that they accelerate diversification efforts to India, let's say, the more that Chinese customers will be upset with them, right? If I'm Chinese and I'm debating between Huawei and Apple, and all the news I'm reading about Apple is that they're decoupling from my country because they think of our country as a political risk, I'm probably going to buy the Huawei, right? And Apple has a $70 billion business in China. So they can't risk Chinese consumers thinking like that. Like Chinese consumers rightfully consider the iPhone an indigenous product. Mm-hmm. The less that is true, the more problematic it is for Apple. And then if they're diversifying to India, Beijing realizes that they don't want that to happen, right? Yeah. Beijing understands, I think, better than any other country that you sort of have to have this humble attitude of taking on the labor-intensive jobs, and then you move up the value chain. So even though they're in a position where they could give up some of the labor-intensive sort of low-value jobs to a place like India, it's a stepping stone for India to begin rivaling China over the course of 2 or 3 decades. And so they don't want that to happen, right? So China thinks of technology transfer as a one-way gate. They want the information coming in, they don't want it going out.
So what's your conclusion here? It's not gonna, satisfy all the readers to say, oh, it's too late. It's not, the best solution there is, right?
Well, I mean, look, I would love to be wrong, and I would love for Apple to be working with the Taiwanese in particular, because the Taiwanese have the know-how, right? The execution abilities to set up these factories in a place like India. But I don't know how you do that in stealth mode. Yeah. Because if you do it in a way that Beijing and the Chinese consumers are aware of it, China has so many choke points over the Apple supply chain. And there are multiple instances where I've spoken to multiple executives at Apple where they would say, sometimes certain supplies just would hit a roadblock on the way to the factory. And it would be up to the executives to try to figure out, like, why? In a sense, who have we pissed off? Why is there an arbitrary roadblock? So if Apple were to put out an announcement tomorrow that says, Patrick is right, and we're throwing in $50 billion a year into India, electricity would go out at several faculties in China. And then the Apple executives would be sitting there wondering, was there a problem with the grid, or is somebody mad at us? Mm-hmm. Chinese politics is really interesting in that way, in that there's not a lot of like executive emails where things are written down, mm-hmm. and like, you're going to have some treasure trove of letters from Xi Jinping to Apple. It doesn't really work like that, right? There's implicit threats. There's the chapter, for instance, called "Voluntary is the New Mandatory," right? China squeezes you in certain ways where there's like wink-wink arrangements where you're deciding that I'm going to build an R&D center in Beijing. It's not because anyone in Beijing is forcing you to do that. It's just that something's hanging over you. There's a piano sitting on the executive leadership team. And instead of risking that someone's going to cut the rope, you make an investment so that the local cadre is happy with you.
I see. And now I want to talk a little bit about Huawei. You said the best smartphone right now is Huawei. And what does that
objectively
say?
It is, right? Like they've got a phone that unfolds twice. It's actually the second edition right now, right? It's called the Mate XT, but I think then XT Plus or something like that.
Do you think everybody likes folding the smartphone that can fold?
It's more that it's like a marvel of industrial design and of production.
Okay, I just want to know, what does that say about Apple's China?
So it says
policy.
A lot because Johnny Ive once at a Vanity Fair conference in 2014 complained about Xiaomi phones.
Yeah.
And I believe they were built by Foxconn. And I was basically told that, Foxconn was basically sort of gun to their head from Beijing, like, you need to do for Xiaomi what you've done for Apple, essentially mimic the iPhone and make it Chinese kind of thing. And Johnny Ive complained about this and basically said it's a total ripoff, right? They're just stealing everything that we've worked so hard to do. He's never said anything like that since, which tells you what sort of reaction there was, either from China or from Tim Cook's office, that you don't say that kind of thing anymore, right? So that was 11, 12 years ago. But my point is, he just saw them as imitations, right? By 2019, I got more than 1,000 pages of internal documents that show Apple was totally taken aback by how good Huawei, Oppo, Vivo, and Xiaomi phones were. They recognized internally that the Huawei phones were better. They had better specs, faster recharge time, better screens, 3 cameras instead of 1, and at a lower price point. And the Chinese were flocking to Huawei. So in 2019, Huawei outsells Apple, not just in China, globally. Yeah. So it's a major, major threat. So they actually recognized that everything they did in the ecosystem was beginning to support the Chinese competitors, not just themselves. And now we're getting to a point where Huawei sells phones that can be $2,600.
I know.
In other words, it's not a cheap mimicry. It's like the Ferrari of phones. And that's in just a 10 or 12 year period. So that's sort of a stunning trajectory of how fast the Chinese were able to learn, absorb, and reimagine their own phone production systems. I mean, you sort of have to hand it to Beijing and to the Chinese companies. They did a remarkably good job.
When you see these numbers, were you shocked?
Which numbers?
The Huawei, the smartphones selling revenues and the price tag.
I mean, those wouldn't have been the revelations. It was more that it was within documents with an Apple logo saying highly confidential, and it's Apple's own recognition. So it's not that I was shocked, right? Because I'm looking at in hindsight. It's that the Apple executives in 2019 were shocked. So essentially what happens is you have people in Apple in China sending pictures and emails back to people in Cupertino saying, you'll never believe how good the latest phones are.
They were.
Because this all came after the infinity pool design of the first iPhone, right? This was the iPhone 10, right? The 10th anniversary edition. And Apple thought there was going to be like a halo over their company for quite some time. And instead, within 4 months, all the Chinese competitors had figured out how to do it.
What do you think about the speed of the whole China's processes?
Yeah, so I use the term China speed, right, or Shenzhen speed in the book. And in a sense, the unfortunate thing is that there's no such thing as India speed, right? No one is floored by how good the Indian engineers are to get things done. Whereas when Apple was investing in China, they were stunned by how quickly things could get done. So Terry Guo and Foxconn would take 25 days to do something that Apple forecast would take 8 weeks. There's a great example that's not in the book where some Apple manufacturing design engineers are in a factory that's, in a sense, going to be converted for Apple use. So it's filled with machines that they don't want, and they estimate it's going to be 2 to 3 weeks to get all the machines out of there. They go have dinner, they go have a drink, they go home, they go to sleep, they come back to the factory the next day, it's all gone. And they have no idea how it's been done. That was China speed. The Chinese were just awing Apple all the time with how quickly they could take care of things.
Okay, it's also very interesting. You talked about Foxconn and Terry Guo a lot. So right now I want to talk a little bit about Taiwan. So in this show, we talk a lot about the dependency between Apple and TSMC.
I need to start watching.
Thank you. Borderline malpractice. Would you say it's accurate to describe the Apple strategy?
So I quote someone in the book saying it's borderline malpractice. And then I think the next quote of the person is, I'd be nervous as shit if I was on Apple's board. That basically all of the compute for any Apple product you can think of comes out of a little island that we're on, right? And it's an island where that would be fine insofar as Taiwan's a great ally of the United States and the Western world and everything. But China doesn't consider it a nation. Xi Jinping says things like, we're not leaving to the next generation the problem of Taiwan, right? It's going to be reabsorbed into the mainland. So that's what the Qualcomm executive meant when he said, I'd be nervous as shit. This is borderline malpractice.
Yeah, then that's what we've been talking about. So in a war scenario, how is dependency being viewed today?
So, I mean, if we're talking of war where China has taken over or blockaded Taiwan, I mean, NVIDIA, Apple, Meta, Google, they all rely on TSMC for chips. So there would be no iPhone that year. I don't think there'd be an iPhone the next year either, certainly not in the quantities that we're talking about. So I've described it as a meteor strike on Apple's business if there were a blockade on Taiwan. the silver lining is that you wouldn't care where your next iPhone is going to come from if Taiwan is blockaded. There would be so many bigger concerns because you're talking about the world's two greatest superpowers at war with one another.
I don't think the international market is going to accept this outcome. So what do you see is as a mutual assurance? Because the way you put it is as a single failure point.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah?
it is. So, I mean, look, there might be a whole host of reasons why we never get to the war scenario. But the war scenario is unimaginable. I don't have the imagination to say what would happen. I mean, the Soviet Union and America never went to war, right? So there's no precedent for what happens when nuclear-armed countries at that scale and capacity have a battle.
Right.
But if that's the question,
Yeah, in a war scenario. Yeah.
then Apple is in complete crisis. The only thing is that there would be so many other crises at the same time that the front page would not be about Apple, right?
Because these lead to my next question. Because after Trump era, we've seen the bans on Huawei and the efforts to pull TSMC production into the United States. So if Apple ultimately couldn't decouple from China, so how much strategic value does reshoring TSMC really buy?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, it's not. So for Apple, I think the value of TSMC moving to Arizona is pretty de minimis. The reason I say that is because Apple's biggest need from TSMC is the bleeding edge node, right? The most capable next generation things that they're doing for every iPhone. And TSMC is not moving that to Arizona. And they shouldn't be, but they're too smart. They're not doing that. They want to maintain the silicon shield in Taiwan. So in other words, all the major orders that Apple will be ordering from TSMC are still coming out of Taiwan. Now, maybe AirTags and other devices, older iPhones, etc., are going to be securing chips from Arizona. But from Apple's perspective, I don't think TSMC's move does a whole lot. From TSMC's perspective, I think it does do a lot. Because TSMC is like obviously a world-class business. I mean, it's arguably the most important company in the world. And for their risk assessment, I don't think it makes sense to have everything in Taiwan. So they're diversifying. They're too big for Taiwan in a certain sense. They're too important for one country. So especially a small country, right? I mean, from China's perspective, it's the size of a city. So for them to be diversifying to Germany, Japan, and America,
Yes,
I think that makes all kinds of sense.
So my final question is, if you were to write a Taiwan chapter of Apple in China today, not as history, but also as something that is still unfolding, where would you begin?
So it's not hypothetical because I've had to write an epilogue for the paperback edition that comes out in a couple months.
Okay.
And although this answer
wow.
isn't specifically about Taiwan, I think it's
What
still
is it about?
relevant.
Okay.
So it's about many things, but the main thing that I try to do is, the story is very much a narrative. There's not a whole lot of points where I get to pause and just give some analysis. So for the epilogue, I thought I would do that. And so I sort of pontificate on Chinese capitalism. And
Chinese capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, capitalism is promiscuous. It'll work with any sort of system. It sounds like it, but capitalism works with slave labor, with serfdom, with wage labor, with restricted stock units, and with a state party.
Right, all sorts of definition text that, yeah.
Yeah. But I think people will mistake that all the time, and they think it has to be a Western form of capitalism, and it doesn't. So there's this Taiwanese idea that comes from Stanley Shi in the 1990s, which is the smile curve for product development.
Yes.
And Apple is the master of the smile curve, right? So they do the value of the product inception, product design, so Johnny Ive, and then they outsource, right? This was sort of Taiwan's contribution to take on this stuff, the manufacturing and the logistics, and then the curve comes back up for the retail branding, basically the Apple store, right? The marketing and so forth. And the idea is the value, the profits are on the ends of the curve, and we should outsource everything else. I think China's great understanding was that at the national level, the curve isn't a smile, it's a grumpy face, right?
A grumpy face, what's the curve of that?
So the value for the nation isn't the
grumpy
profits,
face.
it's the capabilities. So instead of thinking about things in terms of profit, Beijing is thinking about what are the choke points we can hold over international economy? What are the state capacities that we can use both in peacetime and in wartime, right? So they really value industriousness. So people mistake all the time that maybe Huawei is not that important of a company because it's not worth that much, right? Xiaomi isn't worth that much. There's no Chinese company that's worth $1 trillion, and there's like 6 American companies. And so Americans are always complacent about thinking how well they're doing because they're at the top of the league tables. But none of those companies know how to do anything without their dependence on Taiwan and in China, right? NVIDIA's worth $5 trillion. It doesn't know how to build a chip, right?
Still doesn't.
Yeah, it still doesn't. And they're not even trying to. So Apple is a great company, but they're still designing the phone, they're marketing the phone, but they're not building the phone. And so from a corporate perspective, they're doing everything they can to get the most profits, and therefore they're worth the most. But China has a different strategy, and it's a pretty incompatible one. And they're really competent and smart and strategic. And the result is that they installed 50% of the world's robots last year, right? China is just on another scale when it comes to actually building stuff. I think that's scary in peacetime. It's unimaginable what that means in wartime.
But in that frame, what does that mean for Taiwan? Because you talked about China's capability right now.
Well, let's try to end on a high note. Don't ask me about that, because I'm saying that they've got the capabilities to absorb Taiwan. I hope that doesn't happen, but it's a question of what the international response is and so forth. It's not a question of can they do it.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about, this is the first time here in Taiwan, right? How do you feel when you, because I assume you read about Taiwan on news and often probably nerve-wracking news about Taiwan, but you're actually here right now. How do you feel?
I'm loving Taiwan. I mean, it's been fantastic. The people have been great, and I don't know, everything's been wonderful here.
Did you get to talk to people in the industry that you're interested? What's your focus here? Without, of course, you're engage more audience with this book. Did you get a chance to talk to?
So like there's a book called Rival Partners by Wu Jaemin, who I cite frequently in the book, and I got to have dinner with him the other night, and I mean that was like meeting a rock star for me.
Before we wrap everything up, I'm still very curious why Foxconn is such a great partner to Apple.
So Foxconn and specifically Terry Guo were really able to anticipate Apple's needs before Apple understood them. And so they would actually execute moves like, building factories and getting lines ready before Apple had even asked for them, right? And they were doing this in such a way that then they would win those orders. But I don't think Foxconn's been doing that recently. Their focus is on AI and data centers, but it would be great if the Taiwanese were really playing a role helping Apple diversify outside of China.
Okay, I see. Such a pleasure to have you here, Patrick. I
Thank
know
you,
this
pleasure.
is your first time here. I hope there's more chances to come to see you onto
too.
our show and to Taiwan even more.
Yes, I hope so.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.